Mexicania. For our program this week, we're going to find out about sarapes. Sarape is a Spanish word which means a type of blanket, and we're going to see some people at work making these sarapes. They use lana, or wool, for most of them, and we will see various kinds of sarapes made. Senor Farrington, what are some of the interesting places in Mexico where sarapes are made?
Typically, Senora McHenry, the sarape of Saltillo is the most famous, particularly with the tourist trade. However, blankets are made by Spanish-speaking people throughout the Americas because part of Mexico is quite high, so is South America. It's cold, and these blankets are quite useful, so the sarape is standard. In Mexico, in the southern part, a heavier type wool blanket is made, and we think that would be the interesting one for us to watch in our program this week. The sarape as is manufactured in the southern portion of Mexico. We're going to watch the wool as it is washed in the river and all of the processes that are necessary from the raw wool to the finished sarape, Senora.
Here are two ladies washing the wool in large canastas, or baskets. That's a word we've had before, I believe, on our program. They're rinsing it carefully and then draining the water from the wool or the lana.
The word canasta is one of three words that we learned: canasta and rio, river, and agua, the water in the river. Notice that the canasta is held on the back with a rebozo, which is also a wool product that is woven locally and is worn by women to give them warmth and also to carry things.
The little girl there was helping her mother carry the wool back to the place where it is dried, and here she is shaking it out on the ground for the drying process.
Notice the adobe wall in the background of that picture, and now the carrizo or cane wool partition that's in the back of the yard. The wool is spread out in the sun, and after it's dried it is plucked, that is, it's pulled apart, separated so that it can be worked. Here it's in the canasta again. This is a black or darker wool.
What is this lady doing in the picture?
Well, these are two boards with handles and many wire teeth, and by placing the wool on one of the boards and combing it against the other, she straightens out the fibers, removes the tangles, and makes the wool easier to work with.
After this is done, we will see the next important step in the making of a wool sarape, and that is the actual forming of the thread, or the spinning of the wool into thread.
Yes, they take the raw wool and separate it, as the young lady is doing, into the proper consistency to spin on a spinning wheel. In the background is a very beautiful example of an intricate pattern woven by hand in one of these sarapes.
This is an eagle, which is very common on Mexican designs, is a very popular design among the people.
Yes, the tourists particularly like to buy these Mexican eagles, el águila mexicana. This is the spinning wheel, and she's holding the wool in one hand in the raw shape, and as she spins the wheel with her right hand, she allows the twisted thread to be pulled from her hand and wound on the bobbin of the spinning wheel.
These spinning wheels were used a great deal in our country many years ago. We don't see many people nowadays, though, who know how to operate them.
Yes, they've become collector's items. However, they are used in these small family industries throughout the Spanish-speaking Americas.
There, the wool is being taken off of the wheel, and the man is beginning to mix his dye so that he can form the right colors for the sarape, which he will be weaving later on, mixing the dye in the dish that's made of clay.
We watched in our first program an industry in which a family makes the cochinito and other ceramic products. This is the type product of clay, baked clay, that forms one of the industries that we have studied. Notice the crack in the top of the clay pot, and that it stands in the fire without cracking.
This is the wool after it has been dyed. Now it's being straightened and will be hung out to dry in the patio, or the backyard, so to speak.
notice that the whole family is engaged in this enterprise. Here the wool is being placed on a rack, a holder, that's somewhat crude. In modern factories, that will be a better product than we have here, but it serves the purpose of holding the skein of wool as he unwinds it and twists it to make it smaller and harder and stronger, twisting it on the bobbin from which it will be removed in the weaving process.
This bobbin is a nice small size so that it will be easy to handle when he begins to do the actual weaving. There we see one close up.
By the time the thread is put on the bobbin, it has been dyed and is ready to go over to the loom, where the thread is woven into the serape.
This is, looks like Papa working at the loom now and beginning a design, beginning the lower part of the serape, and weaving the various colors as he goes, making the design as he goes.
Yes, he uses his feet to shift the threads and his hands to pass the bobbin from right to left as he threads the threads between the longer ones that are held on the loom. There are technical terms for this, but for our purposes it's enough to watch that with his fingers he passes the threaded bobbin under the threads and pulls the thing back tight. Then the stick that we can see to the right is pushed against the woven part to give it a certain amount of compactness, to push it together. See how it works?
Yes, and this man, I imagine, has spent many years learning how to do this, and he does it very rapidly, very carefully, and it becomes a perfect design.
The design that we see here is repeated in stonework in Mexico as well as in serapes, and we've seen a similar pattern in our silver, in the plata. These two handles that we see that he works with his feet are to shift the threads, to raise one section of it and lower the other. See how it works as he passes the threads between the sections of the loom. There he's stretching it from one side to the other to hold it tight. The type serape that he's working on is a heavy one. The whole family, here we see 3 members of the family who together have been working on this particular product, making a serape similar to the one we have here, Senora McHenry. The pattern was quite similar,
yes.
You'll notice, and it's a heavy serape. The threads are quite thick, even on the fringe, and it is all wool. No linen or any other cotton threads or anything like that are in this particular serape.
Now, the second part of our film concerns a different type of serape, not with the same type of design, but rather one with stripes. And we shall see how it is made in a little bit larger place. Actually, it's a regular factory, and here we see the front of the factory, where we can visit, or anyone can visit if he desires.
Yes, this is called El Guerrillero Fábrica de Saltillo, and the serapes that are made there are of a different texture. They are quite a bit tighter and a little bit thinner. The wool thread that is used is much finer, and the thread that holds it together is of linen, so that the serape is really, it's waterproof.
This is the dyeing again, and now that the thread has been taken out of the dye and is put outside to dry before it is spun.
Well, we're going to see exactly the same steps now in a factory that's a bit more commercial than the one we saw in the southern part of Mexico, although there are many large factories there too. But this machinery that's used in the factory in Saltillo is a bit more modern, it's more commercial, it's a little bit more what we're accustomed to. But it still is the basic step of the raw wool through the washing, drying, dyeing, spinning, and weaving to furnish us with a serape.
I noticed that this spinning wheel is much larger and much handier than the other one was. He seems to be working a little faster. And Pablito there was watching his father work the spinning wheel, and probably will be allowed to do it himself one of these days.
Oh yes, he will grow up with this profession. However, we have noticed that in the small family unit, the children study. Even in the larger factories, the children are also learning the profession that their father uses to earn his livelihood.
He's working on a very large loom there, and working much faster than we saw in the first part of the film. it's a little bit more modern looking too.
He's working a solid pattern there, a solid color, so that he need not separate the threads, but merely pass the bobbin from one side to the other all the way across the full width of the serape. Another interesting thing, Senora McHenry, is to notice that the threads used here are much finer, much smaller than the threads we watch them using in the southern part. This is Pablito again as he watches the weaving process, and now we're working with the pattern.
This looks like it is going to be the center of the serape with a characteristic design that we see in most of these Saltillo serapes.
Notice the threads as they move up and down. After the bobbin is passed through, the threads change position. And there's a very interesting view of the size of the threads as we notice how they move up and down and the certain amount of fixedness with which the father watches his work.
That's an interesting shot of the loom.
You can see the threads change position very clearly in this view.
There is the display room now, and we see all the finished serapes of many different designs, and some perhaps like the ones that we have here in the studio. There is one that has a very familiar design.
Let's look at the serape similar to the one we have been viewing in the picture and see how much we can pick out of what we have learned. First, we have seen the small threads that run along the length of the serape and later form the fringe, and then the colors as they appear in the serape. This solid color, and then notice this one, Mrs. McHenry. Senora, what is interesting about that?
Yes, this is very interesting because it starts with a very pale shade and shades into dark red.
And then we have a three-color division, and again the repetition of the shading, and then a solid color. But in the very center of the serape is the middle part that we talked about. Now this design is interesting in that each man makes different patterns and does not repeat the pattern. The only thing that you can compare in here is one half of the pattern to this side as against this half of the pattern. But the overall patterns vary from serape to serape.
So that actually he is repeating on one half what he starts on the first half. Is that the idea?
That is correct. Among the many industries that are in Mexico, and wherever we have a Latin American or Spanish heritage, will be the serape industry. In addition to that, there are many factories that work with wood products. For our program next week, we're going to watch the manufacture of a molinillo, Senora McHenry.
What is a molinillo?
A molinillo is a little beater with which chocolate is whipped so that it will be foamy. Until next week, Senora McHenry, muchas gracias y adiós.
Adiós, señor Farrington, y adiós a todos.
This is National Educational Television.